Hi, and welcome to the Safe Routes to School recommendation process webinar. My name is Leanne Ferguson. I'm the Safe Routes to School Infrastructure Program Manager for the Oregon Department of Transportation. We'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for submitting applications for the Safe Routes to School Infrastructure Competitive Grant Program. This is the first time we've run this program, and seeing that getting all of your applications and being able to see what the need is out in the state of Oregon was really helpful. We had $85 million worth of projects applied for and only had $16 million to allocate. So thank you very much for taking the time to fill out the application and help us see where a lot of the needs are throughout the state. So in this presentation, we'll go over the timeline, the analysis of the applicants, the process that we used for selection, the Safe Routes to School Advisory Committee, and the lens that they put on that process, and then the next steps. So we started in about June of 2018 with workshops doing outreach for the Safe Routes to School Infrastructure Competitive Grant Program. Again, we had $16 million. Applications were due in October. We got 112 applications equaling about $85 million in requests. In October and November, staff did the scoring process and the ground conditions review, which we'll go over in detail. And then in December, the Safe Routes to School Advisory Committee met. In January, the project list was approved by the Oregon Transportation Commission, and now in March we're starting to, in February and March, we're getting the IGA signed for the 24 selected projects. So from the 112 applications, there were about 206 projects, and you can see that they're spread out pretty well around the state, a lot around the I-5 corridor as you can see from the map, but in all of the regions we saw applicants and projects submitted. So in this map you can see a little bit better breakdown of those projects and where the schools are located in the state. So we'll use Region 3 as an example. Region 3 submitted 12% of the applications for the Safe Routes to School funds. They have 13% of Oregon's public schools and 16% of Oregon's Title I schools, which are low-income schools, and they requested about 18% of the funding. So a little bit of review on the scoring process. We got a bunch of information. All of the applicants came in, and we needed to narrow it down to one project list. So our first step was to review all 112 applications and apply a staff score, or an empirical score, and do an eligibility review. We used a scoring process that was passed to us from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, which was pulled together to address the new legislation that dedicated the funds to Safe Routes to School. The Rulemaking Advisory Committee helped us set priorities for this first round of competitive funding. The high priorities were Title I schools, so a high equity component. Title I schools are schools where 40% or more of students are eligible for free and reduced lunch. Also, safety was a priority. And project readiness is a priority because we'd like the projects need to be built within 5 years. Elementary and middle schools were also a priority as part of the statute that was written in House Bill 2017 Keep Oregon Moving Act. Some medium priorities were things like proximity to school, how close is the project to the school, mutual benefit, does the project have benefit to multiple schools, as well as connection to education and encouragement programs. So you'll see from this chart there's a possible score of 500, and the chart on the right shows what piece of the pie each of those priorities had. You'll see equity is definitely the highest, followed by school type, safety, and readiness. So now would be a good time, if you have it, to pull out your application. We're going to go through this scoring process with your application with you. So grab your application and we'll start walking through it. So as you'll see in the far left column, there is there's a priority area column, and then there's some categories in each of those priority areas. Then there's a column that tells us a little bit more about how we score each of those pieces, and then the actual score, the number of points for each of those categories, and then the total possible score in each category. So we're going to start with equity. Again, equity is prioritizing our low-income schools where 40% or more students are eligible for free and reduced lunch. I wanted to note that this scoring matrix was approved by the Oregon Transportation Commission in August of 2018. So starting again with equity. So Title I schools, if you look at Part 3 of your application under background, the fifth question down is about, is your project serving a Title I school where 40% or more students are receiving free and reduced lunch? If you answered yes to this question in your application, you received 160 points. The next question asks what percentage of children that are attending that school are eligible for free and reduced lunch, and that's where the second section comes in, where if the percentage was 41 to 60%, you got an additional 10 points. If it was 81 to 100%, you got an additional 40 points. So an applicant was able to, at the most, get 200 points for this category out of a total of 500. The next section is about project readiness, and I'm going to switch to the next slide because it goes into it a little bit more detail, and then we'll come back to this slide. So project readiness includes things like right-of-way, utilities, stormwater, environmental, and public process and design. So the very first section is right-of-way. You'll see that a couple of questions down, still in Part 3 in background, it says, does this applicant own sufficient right-of-way? So in this section, each of the subcategories, right-of-way, utilities, etc., you could get 1 credit for that particular category. In the whole readiness section, if you got 1 credit, you got 0 points, 2 credits, you got 0 points, 3 credits, you got 20 points, all the way up to if you got 6 credits, which means a full credit for each one of these things, you got 80 points. And there were ways to get partial credit, and we'll look at that with the right-of-way. So does the applicant own sufficient right-of-way? 1 credit was given if the applicant or the agency delivering the project owns the right-of-way or has an easement. And then half a credit was given if they were in the process of figuring out the right-of-way. And 0 credits was given if they chose I don't know, meaning they don't know if they own the right-of-way or not. Again, this is trying to determine project readiness and if the project could be completed within 5 years. The second question is around utilities. A little ways down, right under the right-of-way questions, there's a question that says, will any utilities need to be relocated? So the example for this is that 1 credit was given if if the applicant didn't need to move utilities, or if they figured out the details of the utilities. They did need to move it, but the utilities company was going to pay for it, or they knew all the details. Half a credit was given if they knew it was an issue but haven't figured it out yet, and 0 credits were given if they didn't know if they need to move utilities or not. The next section is stormwater. If you keep moving down in Part 3 in background, you'll see a question that says, describe how your project impacts stormwater drainage. So 1 credit was given if they don't need to address stormwater, if they have it all figured out. Half a credit was given if the applicant knew it was an issue but hadn't figured it out yet, and 0 credits were given if the applicant did not know. The next question down is the environmental questions. Are there any environmental resources within or adjacent to the project area? And are there any environmental hazards within or adjacent to the project area? And then if the applicant answered yes, it asked to describe what the mitigation tactics were going to be. So the example of the credits on this section are, there was 1 credit given if they don't need to address environmental, if they have figured out all of the details. Half a credit was given if they know it's an issue but haven't figured it out yet, and 0 credits were given if they don't know if it's an issue or not. The public process section is below the environmental question, still in Part 3. Briefly describe public process outreach around this project date is the question. There's also identify any concerns that have been raised in the public outreach process. Is additional public outreach necessary, and describe that. So all of these questions help determine if 1 credit was given if they had completed the public process or have done due diligence. Half a credit was given if they did outreach, but it was a long time ago or did not seem necessarily effective for the project in its current design. And 0 is for no outreach has been done yet. The final category is for design. The question in the application says, describe any design work started or completed on the project. And then the applicant attached that design work to the application at the end. So an example is that 1 credit was given if they have attached the design documents, half a credit was given if they started design or have attached conceptual design, and 0 credits were given if they had not started design at all. So for example, if you had gotten full credit on all of these different categories, the applicant would have gotten additional 80 points for readiness factors. I'm going to go backwards to the earlier slide and jump back into safety. So the safety questions were located in part 4 of the application under location information. So the applicant provided all of the location information for all the different locations in their holistic project. So under each location, the question was asked, is there a history of school-related crashes at this location that this project would address? And if the answer showed that there had been a crash with a non-serious injury, the applicant got 5 points. If the answer indicated that there had been a serious injury or fatal crash, then the applicant got 10 points. Moving further down, we asked for posted travel speed or operating speed. If either of these were 30 miles per hour, the applicant got an additional 5 points. If it was 35 miles per hour or greater, the applicant got an additional 10 points. Also under safety, the lanes or crossing distance. Still in part 4 under location information, the question is asked, what are the number of travel lanes and the crossing width of the road? So if the travel lanes were 3, the applicant got an additional 5 points. If the travel lanes were 4 or greater, the applicant got an additional 10 points. And then the final piece on the average annual daily traffic, the question says, at the project location, what is the average annual daily traffic? If the applicant listed 3,000 to 5,999, additional 5 points were given. If it was 6,000 or higher, an additional 10 points was given. So this final little piece under safety called priority safety corridor, that you'll find the definition in your application, still in part 4. There is a question that says, does your project qualify as a priority safety corridor? If the applicant answered yes, they got an additional 50 points. So the total possible points for the safety section were 90 points. The next section, you skip kind of to the end to part 6 under additional information. And this is where we had applicants listed all of the schools that were affected by this project. We could see easily if 2 or more schools were affected by the number of schools that were listed under this section. So if multiple schools were listed, then the applicant got an additional 15 points. There is a question that says, under the school section, how far from the school is the project? If it was within a half a mile or less, the applicant got an additional 15 points. The school type is the question is right next to the distance question. What grades are taught at the school? If it was kindergarten through 8th grade or any combination of those grades, the applicant got an additional 15 points. Then for the education and encouragement points, the very next question says, describe past, present, or upcoming safe routes to school, non-infrastructure programs at the school or school district. Safe routes to school programs include education, encouragement, and evaluation activities that reduce barriers to children walking and biking to school. So if there was past programming, the applicant got an additional 5 points. If there was planned programming, 8 points. And if there is current programming going on, the applicant got an additional 10 points for an altogether maximum points of 10 points for the education and encouragement programming. So all of these points together added up to a maximum of 500 points. So this is kind of an additional, a graph that shows an example of an application that got 400 points. So the applicant got 160 points for being a Title I school, so that meant it had 40 or more students eligible for free and reduced lunch, 40% or more. The percentage was between 40 and 60, so they got an additional 10 points. The right-of-way and utilities, storm got partial credit, stormwater and environmental got full credit, public process got partial credit, and design got no credits, for a total of 3.5 credits, which gave an additional 30 points to the application. The history of crashes were non-fatal, non-serious injury, but there were crashes, so they got an additional 5 points. The posted speed was above 35 miles per hour posted speed, or 85th percentile was above 35, so they got an additional 10 points. Number of lanes was 3, so they got an additional 5 points there. Average annual daily traffic was above 6,000 for an additional 10 points, and it was a priority safety corridor. They did get the multiple school benefit as well, meaning there were several schools listed under benefits. Schools benefited. Proximity to school was within the half mile. The school type was kindergarten through 8th grade, or some combination of those grades. There was no education and encouragement programming done prior or planned, and the total score was about 400. The eligibility questions that that staff looked at were things like looking to make sure that the project was on public road right-of-way. So double checking that the project is not on school property, which didn't count as public right-of-way. Looking for if the project was something that was mostly for automobiles with a secondary safety benefit for bicyclists and pedestrians. So we were looking for things like, we were really focusing on crosswalks, sidewalks, pedestrian crossing, ways to make it safer, rapid flashing beacons, pedestrian islands, things like that. If we saw a whole lot of paving included in the budget, or if we saw intersections being redone, all of those applicants, we called and talked with them and allowed them to update their application to be more focused on bike and ped projects. Again, we don't have a whole lot of funding, and we had $85 million worth of requests, so we were really trying to focus in on those aspects of a project that would really help address the barriers for the students walking and biking to school. We reached out to about 17 applicants during this process and allowed them to make updates and changes to their application. So step 2, we used those scores to come up with a 200% list, which means a project list that equaled about $32 million, twice of the $16 million that we actually have. That list was apprised of applicants that were scored between about 415 to 500. And we didn't have a 500, about 415 to 465. We took that list, we did a ground conditions review on that, which meant that we looked at the application, at all of the things like speed limit, number of lanes, and we did a ground conditions review either online or in person to determine if the elements that were listed in the application were what could be seen on the ground. We did not find any red flags during this process. All of the applicants seemed to describe the ground conditions adequately. So that led us, here's the 200% list. So this goes into a little bit more details. No applications were flagged during this review. So the final step was we sort of highlighted the 100% list and the 150% list, and sent all of the application materials, even all of the 112 applications, to the Safe Routes to School Advisory Committee for their review. The committee was composed of 18 individuals from all over the state, representing all of the different ODOT regions or entities within all of the different ODOT regions. So we had Safe Routes to School practitioners, we had the Oregon Department of Education, we had representatives from cities and counties, small cities, coastal cities, larger cities, metropolitan areas, counties, tribes. We had equity and health and ADA representatives that made up this group of 18 individuals. The goals of that advisory committee were to work together to agree upon a recommended project list that would be sent to the Oregon Transportation Commission by listening and learning from others and sharing our lenses. And application scores were not adjustable. So this is a map of the 150% list that we sent to the advisory committee. This map shows that the orange squares are the projects that sort of fell within the $16 million or the 100% list. The orange represented the 150% list, which was about $24 million worth of projects. And the purple areas kind of show where the metropolitan planning organization boundaries are. That was really something that the committee wanted to see. They wanted to see if rural areas were able to compete. And they sort of defined that as areas outside of metropolitan planning organizations, because within metropolitan planning organizations, entities would have access to additional funding sources. So here are some of the Safe Routes to School Advisory Committee comments and lenses that they wanted to apply to the lists. So the things that we allowed or asked the Safe Routes to School Advisory Committee to consider are if there were any additional lenses by which they wanted to evaluate sets of projects, and the lens would need to be use information that's consistent across applications. And if projects should be broken up by location, and some locations funded and others not funded, and why. So that was the charge of the advisory committee. Things that they could not consider were things like changing the score of the projects or referring to a specific project that they wanted removed or added without having this sort of additional lens that could be applied to all projects. So the comments that we got back were that advisory committee's members wanted to reduce the scope of a project from the city of Medford as well as from Polk County due to wanting to focus more on the bike ped projects and being able to fund more projects. The lenses by which they wanted to look at the projects were: one, that an applicant could only receive one grant per cycle. Two, there was a recommendation to look at the costs of projects and not fund the higher cost projects. We decided that was ineligible due to that we told folks that the maximum grant amount was $2 million. So to kind of change our mind about that seemed like it was not fair at this point. And really the goal was that people wanted more geographic distribution. And this was solved by implementing the first lens, which was that an applicant could only receive one grant per cycle. So we provided the committee with 3 different scenarios. The first scenario removed a project from Warm Springs, which was determined by the Department of Justice not to be eligible due to the fact it was not on the public road right-of-way. So in this scenario, there were 17 total projects on the list of projects that we could fund with $16 million. The second scenario was that we also used the lens where we pulled out any additional projects from one particular applicant. So we removed the second ranked project from any one jurisdiction from that 100% list. And the result was that we could add 9 additional applicants in 9 additional locations for a total of 22 projects. And then the last scenario, we reduced Medford and Polk County scopes to what was recommended, and we could add an additional couple locations for a total of 24 projects. So the Safe Routes to School Advisory Committee unanimously recommended the scenario 3 after much discussion and some other ideas and adding a scenario 4, but ultimately landed on this scenario 3 unanimously, and it went to the Oregon Transportation Commission in January of 2019 and was approved. The 24 projects were approved. Now we are working on getting intergovernmental agreements signed by grantees, and we're working on a final recommendation report, walking folks through the process of how that list of 24 projects were selected to be posted by the end of February. The next opportunity for funding is The competitive cycle will open again in 2020 to allocate $26 million in the year 2021. Also, we'll have a rapid response program opening in summer of 2019 to address high need projects that occur between competitive cycles and that can't wait for the next competitive funding cycle to open in 2020. So those are the upcoming opportunities for funding for Safe Routes to School, as well as there's some additional Safe Routes to School infrastructure, non-infrastructure funding dollars coming down the pipeline this spring. So go to the ODOT Safe Routes to School program website and sign up to receive updates, and you'll get notices when those application cycles start. Just Google ODOT SRTS and it'll come up on the first thing. The ODOT site will. So, here as well as listed. So again, my name is Leanne Ferguson. I'm the Safe Routes to School Infrastructure Program Manager. And here's my contact information and phone number. Please feel free to give me a call if you have any additional questions. Thank you very much for your time.